Hello and welcome to this, our first in a series of thinking about living faith. What does our faith mean to us on a Monday through to Sunday basis, and how do we live that out? But also, how do we deepen our faith to sustain us through our everyday lives? And I'm really pleased to welcome to join us Steve Rouse. Steve works for an organisation called the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, and I'm sure in a moment he'll tell us a little bit more about who he is and what he does. And perhaps actually, Steve, that's a really good place to start with you just introducing yourself and what you do for LICC and why we should be interested in that in a sense.
Yeah, hey Stuart, it's so good to be with you. Yeah, I work with LICC most of the time, 4 days a week as their church team director. LICC is an organisation that helps people kind of connect their faith with their Monday to Saturday lives. I also work as a Baptist minister still in South London, and I'm well aware of the reality of trying to give people the confidence to live out their faith in their everyday and all the different contexts they find themselves, whether that's work, school, home, or even, leisure, kind of football pitch, basketball court, line dancing, probably like you do, or
Yeah, you all
whatever.
the time.
So yeah, it's become just something that's really at the heart of what I try and do with my work.
And obviously, we've both met before, and I know a little bit about your history, but you've not always been a Baptist minister. You've not always worked for LICC. It makes you sound quite shady, this, but you've had a bit of a past life, haven't you? Perhaps you could, and I kind of think it's an important story to tell because, in a sense, it's that past life that's driven you to where you are today, isn't it?
Oh, massively. And before people panic and switch off, my past life was I spent my first 10 years of working life working in the building trade. Left school at 16, went into building work as a labourer, and then trained as a bricklayer, did my apprenticeship as a bricklayer. And a lot of my reflection about what it means to be a disciple kind of takes me back to that context.
Mm.
I didn't understand it then, but yeah, my context as a builder working on site every day.
Yeah, and I can resonate with that because my working life, is not dissimilar in that I left school at 16, started installing telephone systems, and it was always like, oh, why isn't God using me for some greater purpose? And never realizing that the purpose that God was using me for was right where I was. And so just say a little bit more about how LICC help people to kind of to realize that, I guess.
Yeah, so the work we try and do is, yeah, as you say, really just try and open people's eyes to that in all sorts of ways through all the resources that we have. You'd be amazed how many people in pretty much every sector of working life and in other sectors. We don't just think about work, even people in their retirement just don't think that what they do every day matters to God. Like you just said in the way you talked about your previous life and the previous work that you did, that you know why couldn't I do something that has a greater purpose to it? And I think it's because the church generally, our churches generally that we're a part of, they don't put any focus at all upon our everyday lives. For example, when I was part of the church that I grew up with and I was building, I was prayed for at least once, maybe twice a year because I helped in the youth work.
Mm.
But in all those 10 years working the building trade, I was never on a Sunday or really in any other context in gathered church life. I was never prayed for because I was a bricklayer working on site each day. And so the work we try and do today is both to help churches see that and then help churches develop a culture that really tries to equip people towards that and just tries to remind people and help people see we are the church, not just on Sunday, but 7 days a week. We gather on a Sunday. We think of it as like the halftime team talk, chance to kind of inspire each other, encourage each other. But the rest of the week, we're out being the church in all those different places.
Yeah, I think I remember. I think it's and you've got a great resource called Fruitfulness on the Frontline, don't you? And I think I remember reading that book, and there's a story there about a school teacher who says that once a year the church get her out and they pray for her because she's teaching 10 children in the junior church on a Sunday, but never once had they prayed for her because of the 200 children she comes into contact with every day of her working life. And I think that kind of really brought it home to me about how Sunday morning focused we can be as churches, where I think now thinking of our theme of living faith and how we live our faith out, how we be everyday disciples in everyday life is really important to say. How do we equip people as a church to do that? And in a sense, as disciples, how do we equip ourselves to do that? And I wonder what kind of tips or techniques that you found particularly useful to sustain your own faith, back as a bricklayer, but even now as a minister, because, even as a minister and a work for LICC, you still have your, like you say, I know you're obviously, we can tell by looking at you if you're watching this that you're a big member of the gym, and but you have everyday connections at the gym, don't you, with people that you'll meet there, or the sports that you kind of play and stuff like that. So what techniques and things have you done to help sustain your faith to have those good conversations in those kind of places?
It's a great question. I think I see it very differently today than I did when I was building. I
Mm,
kind of had a sense. I say, and it's not. I mean, the church I grew up with was amazing in so many ways. I didn't even understand there was a gap. I had a sense as a Christian, even at that stage, that I wanted on site each day to be morally good. So
mhm,
tried not to join in with the kind of swearing or the like the wolf whistling at girls or that kind of stereotypical stuff that people think of. Um, what I didn't really understand was the significance of who I was out there. I didn't really get kind of the significance of how I was in a particular place and why that mattered to God. And I had a sense that I cared about the work that I did, but I didn't really see why bricklaying, why building in general mattered to God. What shifted for me, and I think what changes for me, is that nowadays I go out into my everyday life much more aware of those three areas. And I'm trying to develop something on this at the moment. I genuinely think the Bible teaches us that all of us go out into our everyday spaces actually as everyday priests. We're a community of priests, and we go out into places to represent God to others and to represent those others back to God. That the place where we are, I think that God's put us there to try and do our best to try and cultivate the culture of that place,
mm.
do our best to affect it in some way just by who we are. And that what we do, I've come to believe that is making a contribution towards God's restorative work in the world. So that's affected the typical things that most of us do as Christians. So it affects the way I read the Bible, and I'm always looking at it with kind of everyday whole life eyes, and that helps and continues to sustain me.
Mhm,
My prayers have become not so much just always about the kind of crisis in my life and the ups and downs of life, but about the ordinary things of every
mhm.
day. And that sustains me. That I think God cares about that. He cares about just the everyday matters that I'm facing each day. So there has been a big shift, if that makes sense. And I
Yeah.
think I think if I went back to building now, and it's my inspiration. If I get in a room, and I sometimes get in a room with people who work in that particular sector, but in any sector, those are the three things that I'm trying to remind them of.
And so how perhaps in the church that you are part of now, not just your kind of LICC work, which I recognise is the focus of what you do, but in the church that you're part of now, how do you help to nurture that kind of thinking within the members of your church, within the people you worship alongside? How do you help them to recognise that in life, and what tools do you offer them?
That's really good. I what I've tried to do, and this has taken years. So as you hear this, if you're hearing it kind of for the first time, it doesn't happen overnight. But I would say that kind of thinking now runs through most of the things that we do. So I always try every week when we're planning the overall worship to think, is there an element in a prayer somewhere, in one of the songs that we're going to be singing, in something that's going to be said maybe in the preach that will connect to people's every day. So it will run through that. Sometimes we don't do it all the time, but sometimes we'll include little interview stories with people, and we'll do a season of those where, and people may have heard of something like This Time Tomorrow, so you get the chance to
Mm,
invite folk up and just ask them the simple question of where they'll be tomorrow, what will their joys and challenges be, and how can we pray for them. And it's a great way of just putting focus upon where the church are going to be in the coming week. And it comes out as well to some degree, although, I'm always trying to improve on this, the intentionality of the conversations we have over coffee, like just trying to be curious about people's lives. And if you get the opportunity, in those conversations, trying to think when they're trying to think about the week ahead for them, just trying to kind of help them realize that what they're doing matters. So you try to weave it into even, move it from the kind of weather that we often talk about over coffee, or Man City, if you want to talk about Man City or whatever. But you try and move it beyond those things to their ordinary week. So for me, it's trying to run through everything we do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's really quite important. Do you, I know you've spoken a lot about the idea of small groups and how small groups can sustain people's everyday faith. I wonder if you can perhaps say just a little bit more about that.
Yeah, small. I mean, we have small groups in our church. The way I contrast it, when I was growing up, to be a part of a small group, it felt like it was helpful, but predominantly it felt like a small group to me was about gaining more head knowledge, to
Mhm.
know more about the Bible. Sometimes even the questions felt like they were about English comprehension. What did Jesus say to the disciples in verse 11? And somebody repeats that and job done. Whereas the way we approach it now is we try and think, okay, how can we ask questions that connect our understanding of God with everyday life? So we might at some point ask ourselves the question as part of the Bible study. We might ask ourselves, how's this going to help us on a Monday morning? How's this going to relate to that? The other thing, it's staggering how long a small group can exist. And then if a group had existed for a year and then you suddenly got them together and say, can you tell me what Mary does every day? It's amazing how many people can meet week on week and still don't know what each other's interests are, what each other's jobs are. It doesn't even feature because generally in the culture of church life, it's like that everyday life we have. It's not really that important. It's just here we are doing church at the moment. So we would try to foster that encouragement that when you're praying for each other or when you're talking, you're sharing from your real experience, or you're praying for each other, asking yourselves, what's coming up this week? How can we be praying for you? And thinking about that. So just trying to adjust those kind of the prayer aspect of a small group, put in one or two questions that connect the Bible study to everyday life, that sort of a thing that makes a huge difference. And they're just small shifts, but they go in a whole new direction.
I remember perhaps the most profound experience I've had of a small group was a small group that ran inside a prison I was working in as a prison chaplain, and one of the guys came in complaining that his car was no longer fit to be on the road, and his mate could pinch him a new one for £50, and he didn't know what to do. And this for him was a genuine concern. Now that he'd become a Christian, it would never have been an issue for him before that because he would have just got his mate to steal the new car for him. And the group sat around together and talked about all of the principles. And he finished the whole conversation saying, "Oh well, I guess my girlfriend's on the bus from now on, then, isn't she?" But but for him, it was. I found it a really powerful experience because this was his everyday life.
Yeah.
This was his everyday set of circumstances that he would never have considered before. And now he held his everyday life up in the light of his faith. And the conclusion was he had to live it differently. And I thought that's actually, that's a huge challenge to all of us to think about how do we hold our everyday life up in the light of our everyday faith and make decisions that influence what we do and how we live.
Someone like that's in many ways streets ahead of most of us. He's actually applying what he's learning into
Mm.
just the reality, the gritty reality of everyday life. And you think that's phenomenal. If that kind of seed got sown into him and he's making that shift in that way, that's incredible. Although if he could put me in touch with somebody who can get me a car for 50 quid, that
This was a number of years ago now. And I'm not so sure about the legitimacy when you were driving it around. But I just think, I think this is just such an important subject for us all, is to think about this. So often our faith is just centered about what we do on a Sunday. We gather for that hour, and I know that when we've spoken before, you've got this big thing about just changing our language that, we go to church and your big thing is about we gather as for church, don't we? And then we as we go as the church into community, into the places that we live, amongst our friends, whether we're at work or as you said before, whether we're retired, how we're Christians with our grandchildren, with our families, amongst our friends in the coffee shops, in the cafes, in the supermarket, wherever we spend our time, on the golf course, wherever we spend our time, that's actually the place we need to live our faith out.
Yeah, shifting they say language shapes culture, and shifting the language helps to begin to change the church's story in many ways.
Mhm.
So, like you alluded to there, for, I don't use the phrase anymore, but I try when I hear it, to try and take out that language, that idea that we go to church on Sunday, like you said, the church gathers together, and we slip into this language all the time. So I, even within my own organization, I hear people say sometimes, oh, well, when I'm outside of the church, I think, well, but we're never outside of the church. You're part of this community, and that exists 24/7. You're always part of this church wherever you find yourself. And our language and practice, like, even we misuse sometimes scripture, I think, when we say things like, where two or three are gathered, you're there, you're
Mm,
there with us,
mm,
kind of thing. And I think, well, there's truth to that, but it's a misapplication of that passage. It's not about being the church together. And I think it's one of the things that it's quite a hard shift to get people to make in their thinking during the week, to think, oh, I am the church, even though I'm the only Christian in my family, or I'm the only Christian in this school or workplace. I'm still being the church. I'm still representing God's community in this place. I could do with a bit more support sometimes. And that's where I do think it's really
mm.
important to have some connection into, your church family or some Christian friends, and find ways of doing that. That becomes really crucial.
Because
But
it
trying to
feeds
shift
you,
that,
doesn't it? It
yeah,
feeds you.
absolutely. Yeah, definitely. It feeds you. It's kind of like having a running partner or something, if somebody that just is alongside to kind of support and encourage you in what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Steve, that's brilliant. Before we wrap up, you have an everyday life that you live. What can people who are listening or watching this, what can we pray for you about in order to sustain and help your faith?
Yeah, and I say most of my work is involved with kind of gathered church life, but I'd really appreciate prayer. I have a frontline context. It's funny, I was, and not just for the sake of sounding good, but I was at the gym this morning. But genuinely, I've got two frontline contacts in there. I play squash once a week with a bunch of guys. They all know who I am and what I do, and it regularly opens up conversation. I'm regularly conscious of how I'm playing the game when I'm with those guys. I feel like, God's at work there. But at the gym's a strange place for me. I see it as a front line, but I don't really know anybody there.
Mm.
So if people would be praying that for me in that context, God would begin to open up relationships, conversations, just that becomes more of a context where, God has the possibility of breaking into it. That'd be amazing.
Steve, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And thanks so much for your wisdom. And we just pray God's blessing on you and all your work and all your circumstances. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. It's been great to be with you.